Hello and welcome to the Beef Cattle Production Cycle webinars. Thanks to George Haynes and his crew for asking me to record these. I hope you enjoy them. We'll start here with spring and summer in the beef production cycle, and then we'll move on to fall and winter and some cow-calf management decisions in the second recording. So in the webinar today, we'll talk about some basics of the beef cattle production system kind of in the spring and summer seasons. We'll think about it from a spring calving system. So we'll talk about physiological stage and monitoring and nutrient status of a cow herd. We'll talk about colostrum management during the calving season, evaluating calving distribution after calving to see how your previous breeding season performed. And then we'll talk about breeding season and herd bull management and finish up with a few slides about heterosis. So starting in the spring, of course, if we think about calving, we have to consider how nutrient demands change throughout the production cycle. So as you can see here, we have mid-gestation, late gestation, and early lactation energy and protein requirements. So the blue bars are TDN, or total digestible nutrients, which is a measure of energy, and the red bars are crude protein. As you can see, we have quite a great increase from mid-gestation to the last trimester, and an even greater increase into early lactation. So if we take a look at this, we can evaluate some different diet components. So let's say we're going to compare cows during that post-weaning or second trimester stage, the third trimester, and an early lactation. And we're going to use a moderate quality to high quality grass hay that has about 59% TDN and 13% crude protein. Now if we look here, we're going to compare two cows of two different cow condition scores, body condition scores. So in the blue bars, we have a cow in body condition score 6, and in the red bars, a thinner cow in body condition score 3. And like we looked at our previous graph, we have the same three stages of the production cycle: mid-gestation, late gestation, and early lactation. Now if we fed 32 pounds of that grass hay during mid-gestation, both groups of cows would gain weight. The thinner cows would gain a little bit more than the cows in better condition. As we start to increase the amount of requirements from the fetus and then from lactation, we see that we have a different response between the cows in condition score 6 and condition score 3. Now certainly the cows in better condition have more back fat and body to put towards early lactation, and we do expect cows to lose weight after calving, so having those cows in better condition allows them to do that and is less risky from a reproductive standpoint than those thinner cows. So I'm a big fan of the idea of monitoring nutrient status throughout the production cycle, taking a look at body weight and body condition score. Certainly body weight is something that's harder for people to measure, and most people don't. But body condition score is certainly something that we can measure by the eye. And three critical times that are important for this would be at weaning, at the start of the third trimester, and at calving. Keeping in mind that the lowest requirements are going to be right after weaning. So if you have thin cows, that's the right time from an economics and efficiency standpoint to try to go ahead and make sure that we can make some changes in cow condition if that's your goal. So here's some pictures of a cool project when I was in graduate school at New Mexico. Beef cattle specialist there did a fun project where I had some thin cull cows that some folks brought in, and then he fed those up and took pictures of them at different body condition scores. So we have this little Hereford cow here at a 3, 5, 6, and 7. So we know that colostrum is really important to get the calves off to a really good start, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. But we also know that nutrition and how we treat the dam has a pretty important role in colostrum production and quality. So like I said, the immune system starts with colostrum. Calves receive what we call passive immunity from immunoglobulins in colostrum. So these are big globular proteins. And so we recommend and really shoot for having adequate and immediate intake of colostrum for those calves, because it's really essential for their immune system. So when those calves are born, they basically have no immunity, and so they need to have colostrum in order to set that up. Okay, and so adequate is important, obviously, because we need enough immunoglobulins to allow their system to set up to be able to fight foreign bodies. And immediate is important because after the calf is born, he has what we call gaps in the small intestine where those large globular proteins are able to cross the intestinal wall and get into his blood. And as the longer we wait after he's born, the tighter those gaps get, and we're going to have issues with being able to have efficient absorption. So we'll have decreased absorption at an older age, so having enough colostrum at an immediate time point is critical. And we know that the amount of colostrum that the calf gets and how much then crosses the small intestine and ends up in their blood is important for their calf, for their health and performance the rest of their life. And so the question I often get is, well, how much should the calf get and when should it happen? Well, there's about a bazillion recommendations out there, but I think a good goal to shoot for is to have that calf up and nursing within 2 hours. My personal preference would be sooner than that. And if they could have 2 quarts of milk by 6 hours and another 2 by 12 hours, that would be a good goal. So one of my favorite experiments was in Nebraska, where they looked at calves who were born and who they let them get up and nurse and didn't help them at all. And then after about 24 hours post-birth, they took a blood sample from those calves to see how well the colostrum immunoglobulins had reached their blood. And so we had some groups of adequate passive immunity and groups with failure of passive immunity. So if you were a calf that had failure of passive immunity, you didn't get enough colostrum. Now, those calves were twice as likely to be ill before weaning, okay, so we're going to have to doctor them. And they were 5 times more likely to die before weaning. So hopefully that convinces you that those colostrum immunoglobulins are really critical for calf health. Well, how can we as managers do anything about what the colostrum that the cow bills before calving? Well, there's been some cool research that's looked at cow condition score. So coming back to that idea about monitoring nutrient status, we can see that there's several different immunoglobulins. This particular graph is showing us immunoglobulin M in the blood of calves compared to their dam's body condition at calving. So you can see as we increase body condition from 3 up to 6, calves born from dams in better condition had higher concentrations of IgM than calves from thinner cows. And although the relationship is not quite as strong here, we see a similar tendency and trend for immunoglobulin G, which is the main immunoglobulin that we often will measure, and the main immunoglobulin that you'll find, say, in colostrum supplements or replacements that you might buy at your local feed supply store. I will say, though, that somewhere in the 1500-ish range is where we would consider the line between adequate passive immunity and marginal passive immunity. So even calves who are born to thin cows, we would consider to have adequate passive immunity from this experiment. So another cool study in colostrum research happened in Idaho with some first calf heifers. And so they were looking at the level of protein in heifers' diets ahead of calving and how that impacted their calves. And so in this experiment, they had 6 different protein concentrations fed for 100 days before calving, so that last trimester, that last part of gestation. And then when the calves were born, they pulled them from their dams, didn't allow them to nurse, and they were all fed colostrum from dairy cows. So they were fed the same amount of colostrum and had the same concentration of immunoglobulins in it. So what this was allowed the experiment to do then was evaluate how well the calf absorbed immunoglobulins, because everybody was getting the same exact amount and concentration. So here's the results of that experiment. So we can see on the bottom x-axis of the graph we have diet percent protein decreasing from 10% down to 5%. And then you've got the serum immunoglobulin G in the calf's blood. Okay, now remember, if this had no impact, what we fed the dam had no impact on the calves, we would expect that the serum IgG should be the same. They should have the same concentration throughout, because they were all fed the same amount and concentration of colostrum. But that's not what we see. We see that we have a gradual decline from 10 down to 7, and then a sharp decline after that in the 5 and 6% crude protein regions. And those calves in the 5 and 6 we would consider to have failure of passive immunity. So basically what this is saying is how we treat the dam before she calves has an impact on how the calf performs independent from the dam after the calf is born. So you might have read some things or seen some things about fetal programming or uterine programming in the popular press. And so this actually was uterine programming before uterine programming was even cool in the early 80s. So in summary then, in regard to passive immunity, we have to have enough colostrum in the calf, and it has to be early in their life so we can have adequate absorption of that colostrum in order to set them up for a successful immune system for the rest of their life. Both cow condition and protein intake of the dam's diet can impact the quality of colostrum and how well the calf actually can use it. So we certainly can intervene here and have proper calving time management to help ensure that low pre-weaning morbidity. So we want to make sure we limit the number of times we have to doctor those calves before weaning. So pre-calving vaccinations are certainly one way that can help us with that colostrum quality. So there's a whole bunch of options that exist for pre-calving vaccines. So my advice is always to consult your local veterinarian. They'll be very familiar, much more than I would, with what kind of organisms are common in your area. It's common for pre-calving vaccines to have some combination of bacterial and viral strains. So in general, we'll probably have some Clostridial strains and E. coli, and then rotavirus and coronavirus we might also see. So when should you give pre-calving vaccinations? Well, timing is going to depend on what vaccine you end up choosing. And so basically my advice for this and any vaccine, of course, is to read and follow label directions. That will set you up for success. But you do want to remember that adequate time needs to be allowed for the cow to build antibodies to that vaccine, because those antibodies, those immunoglobulins, are that major component of colostrum. So hopefully I've convinced you then that pre-calving nutrition can impact both colostrum quality and the calf's ability to absorb colostrum, and we have control over some of that. Colostrum is very critical then for establishing an immune system of a calf and for their future health on into the feedlot for steers, and perhaps even for the rest of their life for replacement heifers. Now we'll switch gears now a little bit and move on into the summer season. So again, we can think about cow condition. And so this is a different little cow from that same experiment. And here she is at a 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so monitoring body condition going into breeding is also another time we could take a look at it. It would be ideal to have cows on an increasing plane of nutrition going into the breeding season where they are gaining weight that they may have lost after the calving event. So here's some kind of seminal data in the world of beef cattle nutrition and reproduction from Miles City at Fort Keogh. This data shows us the differences between cows and heifers and energy level before calving on how well they perform when it's time to turn the bulls out. So we have groups of cows here that are fed below nutrient requirements before calving, and in cows that were fed just above their nutrient requirements for energy before calving. And then we looked at the percent cows who were cycling at breeding. And so we can see, if we look independently at both bars, you see that heifers, fewer heifers, first calf heifers, were cycling at breeding than the mature cows. And we know that to be true. We know that those young cows need extra management, and we can certainly focus on that as well. But note that, and see here in the low energy, that cows are more resilient to that lower energy than heifers are. But certainly we can have a negative impact on their reproductive performance if we short them too much and they don't have an opportunity to be on a good enough plane of nutrition to gain weight back before breeding. So how can we evaluate how well we did in a breeding season? Well, one way we can do it is by calculating calving distribution after the calving season the following year. So calving distribution is kind of like it sounds. It follows how the cows are calving within the calving season. And so we split that calving season into 21-day periods that are the same as a 21-day estrus cycle. of the beef cow. And there's a variety of ways one could use a starting date. One would hope that you would have a good record so that you would know when you turn bulls out or when you AI'd a cow, and we could take that date plus 283 days of gestation, and that would be your starting date. Some people also use when the third mature cow calves as their starting date. So here's an example from the Beef Improvement Federation Guidelines book of a calving distribution. And so this is in table form, as you can see. In the first column, we have cow age increasing from 2 on up to 5 and over, and then the number of cows in each age group. This is a 225 cow herd. And then the last 3 columns, we have the percent of cows calving in the first 21, second 21, or third 21 days of the calving season. Now, the tabular data helps us kind of organize it, but if you're a visual learner, kind of like me, you might look at this same data in a graph form, which I'll show you here on this slide. So this is the same data from the previous slide, just in graph form instead of a table. So we have the calving period split out into the first, second, and third 21 days on the x-axis, and then the percent of calves born during each of those. And each different color of the bar in each period denotes cow age. So the 2-year-olds are blue, okay? And then the average of the entire cow herd is in that gray with, now I see kind of a white colored label that might be hard to see where you are. But regardless, it might be easier here to see that you have maybe a group of cows that are performing differently than the rest of them. And those are those 3-year-olds in this kind of brick red bar. So you can see that for all the other age groups, the largest percentage of calves are born in the first 21 days. But for the 3-year-olds, the largest percentage of calves are born in the second 21 days. Now we know that calving distribution has an impact on the bottom line, because the earlier and more tighter calves are born, the more uniform group and heavier they are because they're older at weaning when we go to sell them. So this is important. So this might be, if we had a calving distribution like this on your operation, you might say, well, what is it that we did for those 2-year-old heifers last year? How can we improve breeding season for 2-year-olds this year so we don't see this same trend? Try to get more of those 3-year-olds calving in the first 21 days. So what might those strategies be? Well, there's a variety of ways to approach this. Sometimes, often what we do is start to approach it even another year earlier when we're breeding yearlings. So certainly proper heifer development to get those yearlings ready to breed, as well as pre and post calving nutrition for those first calf heifers is critical. Some people, many in fact, start the yearling breeding season early, so those 2-year-old heifers are going to calve 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the mature cow herd. And so this allows them more time to recover after calving before breeding season. Other people have taken another tack on this and actually shortened the yearling breeding season, say from a 45 or 60-day breeding season down to 30 days. And so this puts some selection pressure on those heifers for good reproductive performance. One thing, you would need to keep more replacement heifers back. When you only breed for 30 days, you're going to have a lower pregnancy rate. That's just something that goes along with that. But hopefully the heifers that do get bred in that short season are going to be the fertile heifers that will have longevity to stay in your herd. So most folks that I know who've implemented this are somewhere around an 85% preg rate on those yearlings in a short breeding season. I'm also a fan of the idea of keeping young cows separate from older cows in management groups when it's possible, both before and after calving if you have the room to do it. Another thing that I think is important to consider might be after the breeding season, after you've pulled bulls, if you have a way to sort your first calf heifer pairs off and put them into a fresh pasture, that can really make some good improvements in cow condition and weight as well as calf weight. That's something that actually my family has done for probably the past 15 years, and we've seen some really good results from that in regard to first calf heifer performance. Now, another thing that we can think about in regard to young cow reproductive performance might be early weaning. Certainly we talk about early weaning in the drought years that we do have and have just had here in 2017. And so There's a couple of types, I guess, of early weaning that I think about. The traditional early weaning for a spring-born cow or spring calving cow herd might be, say, August or September instead of October or November. Now, while we probably won't make any impact on reproductive performance this year, because hopefully they've already been bred and the bulls have been pulled, we may improve body condition in such a way that they go into calving next year in better shape, and do breed back earlier the following and subsequent breeding season. If we're in kind of desperate times and desperate measures, and we want to make an impact on reproductive performance the same year, then we need to wean those calves even earlier. So there's been quite a bit of good data that's come out of Montana, weaning calves at about 80 days of age, and once we take away that milk demand from those cows, we see a great improvement in body condition. Those cows cycle back and get bred. The challenge to that system, of course, is that you now have a bunch of 80-day-old calves that you have to manage in some way. And so, but again, like I said, desperate times may call for desperate measures, and that is certainly an option. We can be very successful with that. And wean calves, if we feed them right, they weigh about the same at traditional weaning time as calves that remain on cows. So like I said before, calving distribution can have an impact on the bottom line. So here are some examples of looking at different calving distributions and how that influences weaning weight. So we have the three 21-day periods, the first, second, and third 21 days, and then we also have a few calves, about 15% of the calves were born after day 63, so we have a longer breeding season in this particular example. Okay, so calves that are born earlier in the calving season are older. They have more days under their belt at weaning, as you can see here in the average calf age at weaning column. And so overall, with this kind of calving distribution, the average calf age at weaning is 209 days. Okay, and then the average weaning weight of all of these calves, you can see again the older calves are heavier. So the average weaning weight in this system, where we have this kind of spread out calving season, spread out distribution, is 548 pounds in this example. So my assumptions down here were that the calves gain about 2.2 pounds per day from birth to weaning, and that they weighed about 85 pounds at birth. We have a March calving cow herd that weans in October. All right, so what if we made some management decisions that allowed us to compress this calving season up, so we had more calves born earlier in the season? So here's an example of what that could look like. All right, so we have the same group of cows here. Now nobody's calving after day 63, and we have 65%, almost 2/3 of the cow herd calving in the first 21 days. Notice that we've increased the calf age at weaning now from an average of 209 days to 222, and we've increased the average weaning weight from 548 to 573 pounds. So you can think about how this might impact your situation and your local conditions. So as we get ready for breeding season, an important component of that process is conducting bull breeding soundness exams. And so this is some data from the National Animal Health Monitoring Survey. It's about 10 years old. They're getting ready to do another survey, so we're looking forward to getting those results back. You can see here, this was a survey of beef cattle producers, and so we have the percent of operations that tested bulls before breeding season, and this was for operations that had 200 or more cows. You can see that almost everybody tests new bulls, but less than 2/3 of producers test current bulls. So my interpretation of this data is that if I have new bulls coming in, generally they're going to be sold with the breeding soundness exam guarantee from the seed stock producer you buy them from, whereas others, I guess, maybe make the faulty assumption that if they were good when they were yearlings, they're going to be good for the rest of their life. I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. Certainly do recommend testing every year. So what does that entail? Well, we want to conduct that breeding soundness exam 30 to 60 days prior to the breeding season. That way, if you have bulls that don't pass, you can, and you need to replace them, you can have some time to go out and find those bulls to do that. So a BSE consists of a physical exam, a measure of scrotal circumference, and then an evaluation of a semen sample. You may be wondering why we have pictures of dairy bulls in the lower right-hand corner. But when I was looking for pictures for this set of slides several years ago, I found this in some archives. And so the dairymen were ahead of us with artificial insemination. And so when they first started bull studs to collect semen, they thought that daily exercise was a really important piece of semen quality. So we have these dairy bulls out here on a hot walker. If you know anything about dairy bull temperament, I admire the brave person who put up with these bulls and put them on the hot walker every day. But now we have different ways to provide those bulls some exercise when you go to a bull stud. So during the physical exam, your veterinarian's you're gonna look at the bull visually, also a rectal palpation to make sure they're in good condition, they're structurally sound, and all of the reproductive system parts that need to operate for semen production are in good shape. This is also a good time to review any previous management issues, disease, problems, or stress the bull may have come under. Sometimes we can have issues with semen quality for bulls that are fat. They lay down fat in that inguinal canal, and we're not able to do a good job of regulating temperature of the testes, and we can have some lower quality semen. Bulls that are pushed too hard can have some trouble with lameness issues. Certainly infection and fever, those high temperatures are going to have a negative impact on semen quality. And certainly something that we see a lot of here in Montana is frostbite. And we can have varying degrees, obviously, of frostbite, but certainly that can cause some real negative connotations for semen quality as well. So scrotal circumference, the reason that matters is that it's primarily related to sperm production and semen volume. So the bigger the scrotal circumference, generally the better volume of semen the bull will produce. It's also related to age of puberty in heifers, which we'll talk about when we talk about heifer development in a subsequent webinar, such that the larger a bull's scrotal circumference, the younger his daughters are at puberty. So in the semen evaluation, we're going to evaluate two things, motility and morphology. So when we look at motility, that's are they swimming? Are they moving? We're going to want greater than 30% individual motility and fair gross motility when you look at it under the microscope. And you want greater than or equal to 70% normal sperm for morphology. So here are some pictures of sperm abnormalities. If you look down here in the lower right-hand corner at panel P, that is what we're looking for. That is our goal. The rest of these all have deformities that would severely limit their ability to fertilize an egg. So for example, panel H has no tail. That is a problem. Panel K, they're not going to swim very well. Okay, and so we can have a variety of also head abnormalities, as you can see, for example, panel C and panel A. So when we think about pregnancies failing, okay, if we take a critical look at that, about 2/3 of the reduction in calf crop percentage because of open cows is due to failure of fertilization to occur, or we have fertilization happen and the embryo dies at some point during pregnancy. So there's been some cool recent research that's looked into this problem. And so some data from Fort Keogh would suggest on the cow side that eggs that are ovulated from a larger follicle on the ovary is more successful than an egg that was ovulated from a smaller follicle on the ovary. Now we focus so much on the cow side when we think about pregnancy failure and breed up, but certainly the bull plays a role here too. And so it's looking like that male fertility, in fact, may account for more than 10% of these failed pregnancies. So in other words, 10% of the time or so, a less than optimal sperm is the one that achieves fertilization. And so that, because of those defects in that sperm, that yields to defects in that embryo, which causes it to die. Bull fertility traits are actually, some of them are quite heritable. In fact, so we could select for those traits. So scrotal circumference has a heritability of about 0.7, which is very high. And then we have some sperm abnormality traits that are also highly heritable. And so we have the percent showing a DAG defect, which is the lower left-hand corner, the picture where the tail is curled about. And then we also have another defect called proximal droplets, which you can see you have a droplet left right below the head of the sperm in the lower right-hand corner, and so that's fairly heritable as well. Some more moderately heritable traits include percent normal, and some other two other abnormalities of bowed midpiece and bent principal piece. Gross motility score and percent progressive motility are also moderately heritable. So let's talk a little bit more about managing bulls. So getting bulls in shape for breeding season. If we have new bulls that we've purchased, it's ideal if they can come 30 to 90 days ahead of when you're going to need them so that they can get adjusted to your environment. Visit with your veterinarian about an appropriate health program for them, as well as thinking about visiting with your seed stock producer about how they've been managed as calves. Yearling bulls, if we're going to buy yearlings, it's ideal if they continue to gain 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day. And to yield that, we'd need about an 11 to 12% crude protein diet with about 70% TDN. And then keep in mind that bulls will consume about 10 to 15% more feed than a comparable weight steer would. So we're going to want those bulls in a turnout body condition score of 6. I don't have any good bull condition score pictures, so you're going to have to bear with me on this cow. So with a 6, we're going to want to have no distinct bone structure that we could see. If we were to feel along the backbone, we could feel the transverse processes, but we'd have to push pretty hard. We're going to have full muscling throughout, down the hind quarter, quite full. And then we're going to start to see fat cover become spongy on the foreribs and in the tail head, and the brisket is starting to fill with fat. So during the breeding season, obviously, the plain nutrition of your herd bulls is going to be the same as what the cows are experiencing. So it's important to ensure those bulls enter breeding season in good condition, because if they're doing their job, they should lose between 100 and 300 pounds during the breeding season. You're going to want to monitor those bulls frequently for injury and the like to make sure that they stay in good shape throughout, and get those bulls out of there if they're hurt. Then after the breeding season, we recommend that bulls reach about 75% of their mature weight by 2 years of age. So let's say we had an example where we have a bull that we expect to weigh a ton when he's mature. He's a yearling bull who weighed 1250 at turnout, and if we want to get to 75% of that 2,000 pounds, he needs to be 1,500 pounds by 2. Let's say he loses 2,000 pounds during the breeding season and weighs 1,050 when you pull him from the cows. This means he needs to gain about 450 pounds in the subsequent 9 months. This yields an average daily gain of about 2 pounds per day. Mature bulls that are in good shape after breeding can usually get by on an all roughage diet, but young bulls may need some supplemental energy depending on your forage quality. This is probably one of the main pieces I see when I'm traveling throughout the state, where bulls are neglected. We just kick them out and we hope they do good. There's a lot of thin young bulls that I see, and also bulls that are maybe not on the best conditions during that cold weather, and we have probably a lot more frostbite problems than we wouldn't necessarily need to have if we manage those bulls better. And we'll kind of finish up in kind of philosophical discussion about an established breeding season that has a start and an end. The NAM study looked at breeding season length, and so we can see that there's a huge variety throughout the country. We've got about a quarter of the cows of the operations, in the U.S. that have less than a 64-day breeding season. Another quarter or so in about 85 to 105 days, and then another almost a quarter with 150 days or more. So some reasons that we might consider a controlled breeding season is that we can adjust the nutritional plane of the cattle to their physiological state. If you have a cow who's in the second trimester, a cow who's about ready to calve, and a cow who's at peak lactation, all in the same group, you're not going to be able to do a good job of managing nutrient requirements and feed provided to match those requirements. It's obviously easier to observe cattle for calving difficulty over a shorter period of time than over a longer period of time. And like we talked about when we were discussing calving distribution, the calf crop is more uniform in age and weight. This can also facilitate management, particularly if you have other enterprises that you're thinking about from a farming perspective for the like. If we have a set breeding season, you have a set calving season and can organize your other management around those times. And finally, it's important to be able to identify reproductively unsound cattle and cull those from your herd. And it's a lot easier to do so if you do have that controlled breeding season. So like I said, when we started, we'll have a brief discussion of heterosis here. So heterosis increases production per cow 20 to 25% in Bos Taurus crosses. So if we look at this data from Cundiff, you can see that the amount of heterosis from a straight bred cow who has a straight bred calf is 0. If we breed those straight bred cows to another breed of bull and they have crossbred calves, we've now increased heterosis by 8.5%. But like we said here, the biggest component comes when we have cows that are crossbred who have calves that are crossbred. So we can see here that more than half of that effect, that 20 to 25% increase in production, is dependent on the use of crossbred cows. So why is crossbreeding important and how can it play a role? This is some Hereford Angus crossbred data on longevity and lifetime production. So you can see we have straight bred Hereford cows, straight bred Angus cows. Now we've got crossbreeds, so the sire breed is first. So we have Hereford sired heifers out of Angus cows and Angus sired heifers out of Hereford cows. And you can see the heterosis effect is about 2 years, so the crossbred cows remain in the herd 2 years longer. They wean almost an extra calf and a half, which was about 766 pounds over their lifetime. So I often hear about how terribly complicated crossbreeding is, which I think is not true. But so say that you just think it's too complicated to figure that out. Well, maybe you could use a composite. Okay, so it could be like a Sim Angus bull, for example, would be an example of a composite breed. So here's some data looking at composites and then how much heterosis was retained. So we have the F1 generation, so the first cross, the F2 generation, and then F3 and 4. So you can see we got the biggest bang for our buck in age at puberty in crossbred females in the F1 generation, but we retained quite a bit of that in the F2 and the F3 and 4 generations. 200-day weaning weight. Out of mature cows, we have a good maintenance of heterosis throughout those first 2 generations. Biggest bang for our buck in the F1 generation with calf crop born and weaned. And pounds of calf weaned per mature cow exposed also have a slight decline in the F2, but certainly is impressive nonetheless. So then that completes the first webinar here about spring and summer beef cattle basics. And if there's time for questions and discussion now, this would be when to have that. If not, I'm sure George will have you guys lined out on when to do that after the second webinar.